They say the mountains remember everything, every footstep, every whisper, every drop of blood. In Appalachia, the oldest ridges keep the deepest scars, and some wounds never learned how to close. Folks around here don't write about the war that started in 1670 because no one ever agreed on when it ended. Some claim it still drags on in the hollers at night, fought by soldiers made of fog and fury. Others swear the land itself took sides, choosing who got to stay and who simply vanished. But all agree on one thing: if you hear the drums after midnight, you'd best not listen long, because the dead don't like being ignored, and neither do the things that never died at all. The morning mist clung to the hollow like a shroud, thick enough that Ezekiel Marsh could barely see his own hands as he worked the plough. The red clay of the Blue Ridge foothills resisted the blade, as it always had, as if the earth itself remembered the blood that had soaked into it 30 years ago. Ezekiel was only 42, but he moved like a man twice that age, his back bent from more than just labor. Behind him, the small cabin he'd built with his own hands stood silent. His wife Margaret was inside, tending to their daughter Ruth, who had taken ill with the fever that swept through the settlements every autumn. The cabin was sturdy enough, chinked with mud and moss, but it felt temporary in a way Ezekiel couldn't quite name. Everything in these mountains felt temporary, as if the land itself was waiting for something to be resolved. He paused in his work, wiping the sweat from his brow, despite the morning chill. From somewhere up in the higher ridges, he heard it, the sound that had haunted him since childhood. It started low, almost like the wind moving through the hemlocks, then rose to something that might have been human voices, might have been something else entirely. The Cherokee in the valley below called it Nvoti, the ancient ones. The English settlers had other names for it, most of them whispered, and none of them spoken after dark. You hear it again? Ezekiel turned to find his neighbor, William Craddock, approaching through the mist. William was 10 years older, his face weathered like old leather, a long rifle cradled in his arms, as casually as another man might carry a walking stick. Every morning this week, Ezekiel replied. Getting closer, I think. William spat tobacco juice into the dirt. My grandfather used to say the mountains remember everything, every drop of blood, every broken treaty, every man who died thinking the war was over. He squinted up toward the ridge. The war that started in 1640, when the first English traders came through, that war never ended, Ezekiel. It just went quiet for a while. Ezekiel had heard the stories all his life. How the English had come into Cherokee territory with promises of trade and friendship. How misunderstandings had turned to violence. How a Cherokee chief named Aganunitsi had been killed in a dispute over furs, and how his people had retaliated by burning a trading post. How the English had responded with a campaign of systematic destruction, burning villages, destroying food stores, driving the Cherokee deeper into the mountains. But that was 30 years ago. The Cherokee now lived mostly in the valleys to the west, maintaining an uneasy peace with the growing number of English settlements. Trade had resumed. There were even a few marriages between the peoples. The war was over. Except it wasn't. You think it's the Cherokee? Ezekiel asked, though he already knew William's answer. No. William's voice was flat, certain. The Cherokee hear it too. They're as spooked as we are. This is something else, something older. Before Ezekiel could respond, a woman's scream pierced the morning air. Both men spun toward the cabin, and Ezekiel dropped his plow, running. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Ruth," she gasped, "she's burning up and she's saying things she shouldn't know." Ezekiel pushed past her into the cabin's single room. Ruth lay on the straw mattress in the corner, her 7-year-old body rigid, her eyes open but seeing nothing in this world. Her lips moved, forming words in a language that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. Not English, not Cherokee, but something that seemed to predate both. William had followed him inside. The old man's face went grey. "Christ preserve us, she's speaking the old tongue." "What old tongue?" Margaret demanded, clutching her daughter's hand. "The one that was here before the Cherokee," William whispered. "Before any of us. The people who were here when the mountains were young." Ezekiel knelt beside his daughter, touching her forehead. Her skin was hot as a brand from the forge. "Ruth? Ruthie, can you hear me?" The girl's eyes suddenly focused on him, but it wasn't Ruth looking out through them. The presence behind his eyes was vast and cold and infinitely patient. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of stone grinding against stone. "The war never ended," Ruth's mouth said. "The blood demands blood. The broken oath demands payment. 30 harvests have passed, and still the debt remains." "What debt?" Ezekiel pleaded. "What do you want from us?" But Ruth's eyes had already rolled back, and she began to convulse. Margaret sobbed, trying to hold her daughter still, while William ran for water. Ezekiel felt helpless, watching his child suffer from something he couldn't fight, couldn't understand. The seizure passed after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Ruth fell into a deep sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Margaret refused to leave her side, so Ezekiel and William stepped outside into the midday sun that had finally burned away the mist. "My grandfather saw this happen once," William said quietly. "Back in 1642, right after the worst of the fighting. A settler child, about Ruth's age, started speaking in that tongue, started seeing things that weren't there, or maybe were there, and the rest of us just couldn't see them. She walked into the forest one night and was never seen again." "That's not going to happen to Ruth," Ezekiel said, with more conviction than he felt. "Then we need to understand what's happening, and there's only one person in these mountains who might know." William met Ezekiel's eyes. "We need to talk to Aganunitsi's daughter." Ezekiel felt his stomach tighten. "I thought she died in the war." "No, she survived. She lives up in the high country now, in a place the Cherokee won't go. They say she's become something neither Cherokee nor human. They say she's been keeping watch, waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" William looked up at the ridges, where the hemlock forests grew so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. "For the war to finally end, or maybe for it to begin again." The journey to find Aganunitsi's daughter took 2 days. Ezekiel left Margaret with Ruth, who remained in a fevered sleep, occasionally murmuring in that ancient language. He and William traveled light, carrying only their rifles, some dried meat, and a growing sense of dread. They followed game trails up into the high country, where the mountains grew steep and the air thin. The forests here were old, the trees so massive that 3 men together couldn't encircle their trunks. Moss hung from the branches like rotting fabric, and the undergrowth was thick with rhododendron that formed natural tunnels, dark and claustrophobic. On the second afternoon, they found the first marker, a cairn of stones stacked in a pattern that predated any native people in these mountains. William touched it reverently. "The old ones," he said. "This is their boundary." "I thought they were gone, dead thousands of years ago." "Dead, maybe. Gone?" William shook his head. "Nothing's ever really gone from these mountains, Ezekiel. It just changes form." They pressed on, and the forest grew stranger. The trees began to show signs of deliberate shaping, their trunks bent and twisted into patterns that suggested writing or perhaps warnings. The bird calls that had followed them from the lower elevations fell silent. The only sound was their own breathing and the crunch of their boots on the forest floor. They found her cabin as the sun was setting, painting the western sky the color of blood and rust. It sat in a small clearing, built in a style that was neither English nor Cherokee, but something in between. Smoke rose from a hole in the center of the roof, and the smell of cooking herbs drifted through the evening air. A woman emerged before they could call out. She was old, perhaps 60, but she moved with the grace of someone much younger. Her hair was long and gray, and her face bore tattoos in patterns that Ezekiel had never seen. Not the typical Cherokee designs, but something older. Her eyes, when they met his, were the color of creek water over slate, and they seemed to look through him rather than at him. "I wondered when someone would come," she said in perfect English. "The mountain has been calling, and children always hear it first." "Are you—" Ezekiel began. "I am Awinita. I was Aganunitsi's daughter. Now I am something else." She gestured to her cabin. "Come, we'll talk, and I'll tell you what you need to know. Though I warn you, some knowledge is a burden heavier than any pack." They followed her inside. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, its single room meticulously organized. Drying herbs hung from the rafters. Strange objects lined shelves built into the walls. Stone tools that looked impossibly ancient. Pottery shards covered in symbols. What appeared to be bones arranged in deliberate patterns. Awinita gestured for them to sit on furs spread near the fire. She served them a bitter tea that cleared Ezekiel's head and made his vision sharpen until he could see details in the cabin's shadows that he was certain hadn't been visible before. "Your daughter speaks the old language," Awinita said. It wasn't a question. She sees the old places, the old debts. She has become a bridge, whether she wills it or not. "A bridge to what?" Ezekiel demanded. "To the war that never ended." Awinita settled herself across from them, her hands wrapped around her own cup of tea. "You English think history is something that happens and then is done. You think a treaty signed is a conflict resolved. But the land does not work that way. The land remembers." William said something similar. Ezekiel said, "William's grandfather was a wise man." Awinita nodded to the older settler. He understood what many do not. When the English came in 1640, when they traded and then fought and then killed my father over a misunderstanding about some furs, they thought it was just another border conflict. Just another dispute to be resolved with violence and then forgotten. "It wasn't?" William asked. "No. Because they built their trading post on ground that was already claimed. Not by the Cherokee. We knew better than to build there, but by those who came before. The people who lived in these mountains when they were young, who built the mounds down in the valleys, who spoke the language your daughter now speaks. Ezekiel felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. But those people are gone, dead for thousands of years. Are they? Awanita's smile was sad and terrible. Or did they simply retreat into the mountains, into the hollow places where time moves differently? When the English built their trading post on the old sacred ground, they broke a boundary that had held for longer than your people have had writing. When blood was spilled there, first English blood, then Cherokee blood in retaliation, then more English blood in revenge, the old ones woke. That's madness, Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? You hear them in the morning mist? Your daughter speaks their language. All across these mountains, the boundary between what was and what is grows thin. The War of 1614 never ended because it was never truly about the English and the Cherokee. It was about the old debt, the old claim, the old inhabitants who never truly left. William leaned forward. What do they want? What they have always wanted. These mountains, this land, they were here first, before the Cherokee, before the English, before anyone, and they want their home back. That's impossible, Ezekiel said. There are hundreds of us now, thousands more coming every year from the coast. We can't just leave. Can't you? Awanita stood and moved to one of her shelves, taking down what looked like a piece of slate covered in strange markings. Every year, more children speak the old tongue, more see the old places, more walk into the forests and don't return. The Cherokee are already moving west, though they don't admit why. How long before the English follow? You're saying we should abandon our homes, our farms. I'm saying the war never ended because it was never between the peoples you think it was between. And now, after 30 years, the old ones grow impatient. They speak through children because children still remember how to listen. They manifest in the morning mist because that's when the boundary is thinnest. And they will keep pushing, keep claiming, keep taking back what was always theirs. Ezekiel thought of Ruth, burning with fever, speaking words that had been old when the pyramids were new. Is there a cure? Can my daughter be saved? Saved, perhaps. But she will never be the same. She has been marked now, chosen to carry the message. The question is whether you will listen. What message? Awanita returned to her seat, and in the firelight, her face seemed to shift, becoming for just a moment something ancient and inhuman. That the war is entering its final phase, that the old ones have decided 30 years is long enough to wait for the debt to be paid, and that before the spring comes, every settler in these mountains will have to make a choice, leave willingly or be taken by the forest. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole. Outside, the night pressed close, and from somewhere in the distance came that sound again, the not quite human voices singing in a language older than memory. There has to be another way, Ezekiel said desperately. Some kind of treaty, some kind of payment or offering. There was a treaty, Awanita said softly, made long ago when the Cherokee first came to these mountains. We agreed to live in the valleys and leave the high country to the old ones. We agreed to respect the sacred places and never build where the boundary markers stood. But the English knew nothing of this. They built where they wished, and when violence came, as it always does when boundaries are crossed, The treaty was broken on all sides. So how do we fix it? William asked. How do we end this war? The same way any war ends, with sacrifice, with acknowledgement of wrong, with payment of debt. But the price? Awenita looked into her tea as if reading something in its surface. The price will be steep. The old ones do not accept payment in gold or furs. They accept payment in life, in land, in blood. That's barbaric, Ezekiel said. Is it? Your people burn Cherokee villages. My people burn English settlements. The old ones simply want their home back. Who is the barbarian in this story? Awenita's eyes fixed on Ezekiel. Your daughter has become a bridge. Through her, you could speak with the old ones. You could negotiate. But negotiation requires that you have something to offer, and I fear you will not like what they demand. Ezekiel stood abruptly. I need to get back to Ruth. I need to be with my family. Yes, Awenita agreed. Go back to your daughter. But know this. She will wake in 3 days. And when she does, she will speak with the voice of the old ones. She will deliver their terms, and you will have until the first snow to decide whether to accept them. The first snow, that's only 2 weeks away. The old ones have waited 30 years. They will wait no longer. Awenita rose and walked to her door, opening it to the night. Go. But return when your daughter wakes. Bring the other settlers if they will listen, because what happens next will determine whether this war ends with departure or with death. The journey back down the mountain was a blur. Ezekiel and William barely spoke, each lost in his own thoughts. The forest seemed more alive now, more aware. Every shadow held potential menace. Every rustle in the undergrowth might be something old and patient, watching them pass. They reached Ezekiel's cabin as the sun was rising on the 3rd day. Margaret met them at the door, her face haggard with worry and sleeplessness. She's awake, Margaret said, but Ezekiel, she's not our Ruth anymore. Ezekiel pushed past her into the cabin. Ruth sat up on her mattress, her eyes open and alert. But as Awenita had warned, those eyes held something ancient. When she saw her father, she smiled, but it was a smile no 7-year-old should be capable of, filled with knowledge and sorrow and terrible patience. Hello, Father, Ruth said, and her voice was her own and yet not her own. The old ones have sent me back to deliver their message. Will you listen? Ezekiel fell to his knees beside his daughter's bed, taking her small hand in his. It was cool now, the fever broken, but something fundamental had changed. He could feel it in her touch, the presence of something vast and old, using his daughter as its vessel. I'll listen, he said. Because what else could he do? Ruth's smile widened and she began to speak. The message was simple and terrible. The English had until spring to leave these mountains or face consequences beyond imagining. The old ones wanted their land back, and they would take it one way or another. Outside, the morning mist rose from the hollow, thicker than ever before, and in it, shapes began to move, shapes that were almost human, but not quite. The war that had started in 1640 was entering its final phase, and this time, everyone would have to choose a side. Episode 2. The Terms of Peace. The gathering took place 4 days after Ruth delivered the message. Every English settler within a day's ride of Ezekiel's cabin had come, drawn by rumors and fear, and the undeniable strangeness that had infected the mountains like a contagion. They met in the small clearing where the trading post had once stood. The same ground that, according to Awanita, had started everything 30 years ago. The trading post itself was long gone, burned during the war, but the stone foundation remained, and grass had never grown back over the scorched earth. Even now, in late autumn, the ground was bare and grey, as if the land itself rejected anything that tried to take root there. Ezekiel stood at the center of the clearing, Ruth beside him. His daughter held his hand, but stared past the assembled crowd with those ancient eyes, seeing something the rest could not. Margaret had refused to come, unable to bear seeing what her daughter had become. Ezekiel couldn't blame her. There were perhaps 40 settlers present, all those who had built cabins and farms in this particular stretch of the Blue Ridge foothills. They were a rough lot, the kind who had pushed west from the coastal settlements, seeking land and freedom from the restrictions of colonial society. Men like Thomas Wickham, who had been a soldier in the English Civil War before fleeing to the colonies. Women like Sarah Prather, who had outlived 2 husbands and ran her own farm with just her 3 sons. Children played at the edges of the clearing, not yet understanding why the adults looked so worried. William Craddock stood beside Ezekiel, his rifle present but not threatening. He had spread word of Awanita's explanation, though Ezekiel knew most of the settlers thought it was Cherokee trickery or superstition. They would learn otherwise soon enough. As the sun reached its zenith, movement at the tree line drew everyone's attention. Awanita emerged from the forest, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came a dozen Cherokee, including several elders Ezekiel recognized from trading visits to the valley settlements. The Cherokee looked as uncomfortable as the English settlers, and Ezekiel realized with a start that they considered this meeting equally important to their own survival. One of the Cherokee elders, a man named Kalsata, whom Ezekiel had traded with several times, stepped forward. He spoke in heavily accented English. "The Cherokee have come to hear the words of the old ones. We too are affected by what wakes in the mountains. We too must decide." Thomas Wickham, never one to stay quiet, called out, "Decide what? To let savages and superstition drive us from our rightful land?" "This land was never yours," Kalsata replied calmly. "It was barely ours. We are all here by permission of those who came before." "Ghosts?" Thomas scoffed. "You expect us to abandon our homes because of ghosts?" "Not ghosts," Awanita said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Spirits, yes. Ancestors of a people who built cities in these valleys when your people were still painting themselves blue and worshipping trees. But not ghosts. They are as real as you or I, simply existing in a way you have not learned to perceive." "Then let's see them," Thomas challenged. "If they are so real, let them show themselves." Awanita looked at Ezekiel, then at Ruth. "Show them, child. Open the door and let them see what they have been avoiding." Ruth released her father's hand and walked to the center of the clearing, to the exact spot where the trading post's door had once stood. She knelt down, placing both palms flat on the scorched earth, and began to speak in that ancient language. The change was immediate and terrifying. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the weight of centuries was pressing down on the clearing. The light seemed to dim despite the clear sky, shadows lengthening though the sun hadn't moved. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, they were there. Figures stood among the settlers and Cherokee. So many figures that it was suddenly impossible to move without getting close to one. They were human-shaped, but not human, their forms seeming to shift and blur at the edges like smoke. Some appeared as they might have in life, tall, slender people with copper skin and eyes that held the weight of ages. Others were more abstract, merely suggestions of human form, as if they had been dead so long that even their spirits had begun to forget what it meant to have a body. The settlers recoiled, several crying out. The Cherokees stood their ground better, though even they looked shaken. The spirits, for that was clearly what they were, stood silent and watching, their presence simultaneously menacing and sorrowful. The largest of them, a figure that seemed more solid than the others, stepped toward Ruth. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind in deep caves, of water flowing over ancient stone. "We are the Anikutani," it said, and somehow everyone understood, though the words were in no language spoken by the living. "We who built the mounds, we who raised the cities, we who lived in these mountains when the ice still covered the northern lands. This is our home. It has always been our home, and we want it back." Thomas Wickham, to his credit, found his voice despite his fear. "You're dead. This land belongs to the living now." "Dead?" The spirit's laugh was like rocks sliding down a mountainside. "We are not dead. We are simply in the place between. And for 1,000 years, we have watched you. First, the ancestors of the Cherokee came, and we made a treaty with them. They could live in the valleys if they left the high country to us. They could farm and hunt if they did not disturb the sacred places. And for a long time, there was balance." Kalsata nodded slowly. "The old treaty. My grandfather's grandfather spoke of it. We kept our part." "You did," the spirit agreed. "But then these came." It gestured toward the English settlers. "These who knew nothing of treaties or sacred ground, these who built on our most holy site and spilled blood there, these who disturbed what should have remained undisturbed." "We didn't know," Ezekiel protested. "We didn't know this place was sacred to you." "Ignorance does not absolve," another spirit said, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "Would you excuse a child who burns down a house because he did not know fire was dangerous? The destruction is the same regardless of intent." Awinita stepped forward, positioning herself between the spirits and the settlers. "The old ones are correct. The English settlers broke a treaty they didn't know existed. But the Cherokee and the English then fought each other, spilling more blood on sacred ground. The cycle of violence has continued for 30 years, and the old ones have had enough. They want their land returned to them." "All of it?" Sarah Prather asked, her voice shaking. "The valleys, the farms, everything?" "Not all," the lead spirit said. "We are not unreasonable. The Cherokee have kept their treaty for the most part. They may remain in the lower valleys, in the places they have always occupied. But the English settlements must go, all of them, from the river south to the great mountain, from the eastern forests to the western waters. Every cabin, every farm, every trace of your presence must be removed." The settlers erupted in protest, voices rising in anger and fear. Thomas Wickham pushed to the front of the crowd. "That's insane. That's hundreds of square miles. Where are we supposed to go?" "That is not our concern," the spirit replied. "Back to your coastal cities. Further south, where the land has not been claimed by us. West beyond the great river. We do not care where you go, only that you leave." "And if we refuse?" Thomas's hand moved toward his rifle. Every spirit in the clearing turned to look at him, and the temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed on the grass. When the lead spirit spoke again, its voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then we will take you, one by one, family by family, settlement by settlement. Your children will walk into the forest and not return. Your livestock will sicken and die. Your crops will fail. Your cabins will burn with no source of flame. You will see us in your dreams and wake to find us in your waking hours. We will haunt you until you flee in madness or die in despair. We have waited 30 years for you to understand. We will wait no longer. Silence fell over the clearing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. How long do we have? Ezekiel heard himself ask. Ruth turned to look at him, and for just a moment he saw his daughter in those ancient eyes, frightened, lost, asking him to save her from what she had become. Then the old presence reasserted itself. Until the first snow melts, Ruth's mouth said with the Spirit's voice. By the time spring comes, every English settler must be gone from this land. That is the price of peace. That is how the war ends. And if we meet these terms? Kalsata asked. The Cherokee have kept the old treaty. Will we have peace? The Cherokee have been honorable, the lead spirit agreed. Though you allowed the English to break the treaty by not warning them, by not protecting the sacred places, still, you may remain in the valleys you have always occupied. But if even one English settler remains when the snow melts, the treaty is void for all. Choose your allies carefully. With that, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the shadows and mist. Within moments, the clearing was empty, except for the living, settlers and Cherokee, all of them stunned into silence by what they had witnessed. Ruth collapsed, and Ezekiel caught her before she hit the ground. She was breathing but unconscious, her face pale. The presence that had been using her as a vessel was gone, at least for now. The gathering dissolved into chaos. Some settlers were shouting, demanding to fight, to hold their ground. Others were weeping, already accepting that they would have to leave. The Cherokee spoke quietly among themselves. Then Kalsata approached Ezekiel. The old ones have spoken, the Cherokee elder said. We will keep our treaty with them, and we will not interfere if they encourage your people to leave. I am sorry, Ezekiel. You have been fair in our dealings, but this is bigger than friendship. I understand, Ezekiel said, though the words tasted like ash. You're protecting your own people, as you must protect yours. Kalsata glanced at the unconscious Ruth. The child, she will be valuable to them, a bridge between worlds. Guard her well, or they will take her completely. The Cherokee departed, leaving the settlers to argue among themselves. Thomas Wickham organized those who wanted to fight, to fortify their cabins and dare the spirits to take them. Sarah Prather led those who were already planning to leave, to pack what they could and head back east before winter made travel impossible. But Ezekiel just held his daughter and looked at the scorched earth where the trading post had once stood, the place where, 30 years ago, a misunderstanding had sparked a war that had never truly ended. William Craddock sat down beside him. What will you do? I don't know, Ezekiel admitted. Margaret won't want to leave. This cabin, this farm, it's all we have. Everything we've worked for. Better to lose a farm than a family? Is it? Where would we even go? We have no money, no connections, Back east. We came here because we had nothing there. Then go west, past the great river, where the old ones don't claim territory. Ezekiel looked down at Ruth, so small and fragile in his arms. What if they won't let her leave? What if she's tied to this place now? William had no answer for that. Over the next week, the settlements emptied. About half the settlers believed what they had seen and heard, and they packed their belongings and headed east or south, accepting the loss of their farms as the price of survival. The other half, led by Thomas Wickham, fortified their cabins and prepared to fight an enemy they didn't understand. Ezekiel tried to remain neutral, but it was becoming impossible. Ruth remained in a strange state, awake but distant, speaking occasionally in the old language, seeing things that weren't there, or perhaps were there and simply invisible to everyone else. Margaret was convinced that leaving would break whatever bond the spirits had forged with their daughter. Awenita, when Ezekiel sought her counsel, was less certain. "The child is a bridge," the old woman said during his second visit to a high country cabin. "Bridges can be crossed from either side. If you leave, the spirits may lose their connection to her, or she may become the bridge that allows them to reach beyond their territories. There is no way to know." "That's not helpful," Ezekiel said bitterly. "The truth rarely is." Awenita poured him tea, the same bitter brew that sharpened sight and muddled time. "But there is a third option you have not considered." "What option?" "Make a new treaty." Ezekiel stared at her. "They said we had to leave. That was their term. They said all English settlers had to leave. But what if you were no longer an English settler?" Awenita's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "The Cherokee made a treaty with the old ones. What if you became Cherokee? Or at least something in between?" "That's..." Ezekiel struggled for words. "That's impossible. I'm English. I can't just become Cherokee." "Why not?" "Blood is not destiny. Culture can be learned. The Cherokee have adopted captives before, made them full members of the tribe. If you and your family were to join a Cherokee clan, to accept their ways, to live in the valleys where the old ones have agreed the Cherokee may remain, you would be safe." Margaret would never agree to that. Then Margaret must choose between her pride and her daughter's life. Because if you stay as English settlers, the spirits will take Ruth completely. They will use her as their tool to drive the rest of you out. But if you become Cherokee, if you accept the old treaty, Ruth might remain herself. She would still be a bridge, but a bridge between living peoples rather than between the living and the dead. Ezekiel thought about it as he made his way back down the mountain. It was a radical idea, almost unthinkable, to give up his identity, his culture, his people, to raise Ruth as Cherokee rather than English, to live the rest of his life in the valleys rather than the foothills, following customs and speaking a language that was foreign to him. But was it really more radical than fleeing east to poverty and prejudice, than staying and watching his daughter be consumed by ancient spirits, than dying in a war against an enemy that couldn't be killed? When he reached home, he found Margaret sitting beside Ruth's bed, as she had been almost constantly since the gathering. His wife looked up at him with hollow eyes. She spoke again, Margaret said, in that language, and Ezekiel, I understood her. Just for a moment the meaning came clear in my mind. She said, "The bridge burns on both sides. Choose which shore to stand on, before the flames consume all." Ezekiel knelt beside his wife and took her hand. I think I know what that means, and I think I know what we have to do, but you're not going to like it. Tell me anyway. So he did. He explained our Anita's proposal, laid out the terrible choice they faced. Margaret listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. When I was a girl in England, before we came to the colonies, I had a friend named Catherine. Her father was Catholic, mine Protestant. It was a dangerous time to be different. One day, soldiers came for her family. I watched them drag Catherine and her parents away. And I did nothing because I was afraid. I've lived with that cowardice my entire life. That's not cowardice, Margaret. You were a child. I was old enough to know right from wrong. Old enough to know that staying silent while others suffered made me complicit. She looked at Ruth, then back at Ezekiel. I came to these mountains to escape prejudice, to build a life where we could be free. But I've brought the same prejudice with me, haven't I? The same belief that my people, my ways are superior, that others should adapt to us rather than us to them. You can't blame yourself for that. It's how we were raised. Then it's time to raise our daughter differently. Margaret's voice was firm now, decided. If becoming Cherokee saves Ruth, if it means she can have a life instead of being a vessel for ancient spirits, then that's what we'll do. I'd rather lose.